The porch light was off when I got there, even though I'd called ahead. I remember that detail because in 30 years of visiting that house, the light had never once been off when they knew I was coming. I stood on the bottom step with a quilt in my arms, the same pattern my grandmother had taught me to stitch, blue and white, meant for my grandson's crib. And I watched my daughter-in-law open the door only wide enough to fit her shoulder through it. "Helen," she said. Not Mom. She had never once called me Mom, not in 4 years. But that night, the way she said my name felt like a closed door all on its own. "I brought something for the baby," I said, and I held up the quilt like a woman presenting evidence in her own defense. She didn't look at the quilt. She looked past me toward the driveway, as if she were checking whether I'd come alone. Then she reached behind the door and pulled out a folder, manila, the corners soft from handling, like she'd carried it around the house for days, working up the courage to use it. "Before you come in," she said, "we need you to sign this. I want you to understand something about me before I go further into this story, because a woman my age telling you what happened on her son's porch is going to sound like she's asking for your pity. I am not. I have buried a husband. I have raised a son alone on land that didn't want to give us anything for free. I did not walk up to that porch a fragile old thing. I walked up to it as Helen Greywolf, 73 years old, a great-granddaughter of people who survived far worse than a closed door, and I took that folder from her hands the way you'd take a snake by the head, carefully and without flinching. Inside was a contract, 4 pages, typed, with places for my signature at the bottom of each one. I did not read it that night. The porch light was off, and my daughter-in-law was standing in the doorway with my grandson's cry drifting faintly from somewhere behind her, and all I could think was that I wanted to hold that baby so badly my arms ached with it. A real physical ache, the kind grief gives you, except this wasn't grief. Not yet. It would become that soon enough. "Sign it and you can come in and hold him," she said. "That's all I'm asking." I looked at my son's truck in the driveway, and I looked at the light in the upstairs window, and I understood that somewhere in that house, my own son was letting this happen. I did not sign it that night. I drove home in the dark with the quilt still in the passenger seat, untouched, and I did not cry until I was in my own driveway with the engine off, because crying in front of that house would have been a gift I wasn't ready to give her. Let me take you back further so you understand how a grandmother ends up standing on a porch clutching a folder like it might bite her. I was born on the reservation, in a house with no running water and more love in it than any mansion I've seen since. My mother taught me to bead before I could write my name. My grandfather taught me the stories, not bedtime stories, but the real ones, the ones about how the world got its shape, about coyote and crow, and the long winters our people survived by remembering who we were. I left that land at 19, married a good man named Joseph, and we built a life 200 miles from where I was raised, close enough to visit, far enough to need our own kind of roots. We had one son, Daniel. I raised him the way I was raised, which meant he grew up knowing both worlds, knowing how to fix a truck engine, and also knowing the story of how the buffalo returned to the plains, knowing his multiplication tables, and also knowing how to sit still in the woods until the birds forgot he was there. Joseph used to say Daniel had the best of both of us. I believed that for 31 years. Daniel met Melissa in his last year of college. I remember the first time he brought her home, polite, quiet, careful with her words in the way people are when they're deciding how much of themselves to show you. I didn't hold that against her. We all measure our footing with new family. What I noticed, and what I chose to ignore because I wanted my son to be happy, was that she never asked me a single question about myself that whole first visit. Not where I grew up, not what the beadwork on my wall meant, not why there was a drum in the corner of my living room. She asked Daniel things. She looked at me the way you look at a museum exhibit, something to be observed, not spoken with. Joseph passed 2 years before Daniel's wedding. Heart, sudden, no warning, the kind of death that leaves you standing in your kitchen at 6 in the morning, wondering who's going to fix the porch step now. I won't dwell on that grief here. It is not the point of tonight's story. But I tell you so you understand that by the time my grandson was born, I had already learned how to survive losing the person I built my whole life around. I thought that made me strong enough for anything. I was wrong about what would come next, but not about the strength. Hold on to that. You'll need to remember I am strong, because a woman without spine does not do what I eventually did. Those 2 years alone taught me things about myself I hadn't needed to know before. I learned how to fix the porch step myself with a borrowed drill and a video Daniel found for me on his phone, standing over my shoulder the way he used to stand over mine when he was small and I was teaching him to whittle. I learned how to sit in a quiet house without the quiet swallowing me, which is its own kind of survival, the kind nobody teaches you until you have no other choice but to learn it. And I learned, most of all, how much of my strength had always come from being needed by someone, not wanted, needed, the way a plant needs water rather than simply enjoying it. When Joseph died, that need went with him for a while, until Daniel married and a grandchild became a possibility on the horizon, something to build toward again. I think that's part of why the distance that grew in Daniel's house cut as deep as it did. It wasn't only that I was losing time with my grandson, it was that I had quietly built my whole recovery from grief around the hope of being needed by that family again, and watching a folder appear in a doorway felt like watching that hope get measured, priced, and found wanting. The wedding was small. Melissa's family came from money, not obscene money, but the kind that buys comfort and confidence and the sense that the world generally arranges itself around your preferences. Her father, a man named Richard, gave a toast at the reception about building a modern family, and I remember catching Daniel's eye across the room and seeing something flicker there. Not doubt, exactly, more like the first hairline crack in a windshield, invisible unless the light hits it right, and even then easy to convince yourself it isn't there. For the first 2 years of their marriage, things were what I'd call cordial, not warm, cordial. I was invited to holidays. I sat at the far end of the table. My stories about growing up on the reservation were met with polite silence and a quick change of subject, usually initiated by Melissa, usually about something practical, the price of gas, a home renovation, Richard's latest business venture. I told myself this was simply a different kind of family than the one I came from, and different does not mean wrong. I told myself a lot of things during those 2 years that I no longer believe. Then my grandson was born, Ethan, 7 pounds 4 ounces, born on a Tuesday in March with a full head of black hair, same as his father had at that age. I was in the waiting room, not the delivery room. Melissa's mother had that honor, but the waiting room. And when Daniel came out to tell me, his face wet, his hands shaking with the particular joy of a new father, I thought, whatever distance has grown here, this baby will close it. Grandchildren do that. They pull families back together around something that needs all of them. I held Ethan twice in his first month. Twice. Both times supervised, both times short, both times ending with some reason it was time for me to go. The baby needed to feed, the baby needed to sleep, the baby needed something that always seemed to require my absence specifically. The third time I came to visit, Melissa met me at the door with a printed schedule. Visiting hours, she called it, as though I were requesting entry to a hospital ward rather than my own grandson's living room. Tuesdays, 4 to 5, with advance notice required. I stood on that same porch, the light on that time, and I said, gently, because I was still trying gentleness first, "Melissa, I'm his grandmother. I just want to be part of his life the way any grandmother would." "We have different ideas about what that should look like," she said. "Daniel and I talked about it." I looked past her for Daniel. He was in the kitchen, back turned, doing something at the sink that didn't need doing. That was the moment I understood my son had gone quiet in his own home, and quiet in a marriage is rarely peace. It is usually surrender, worn smooth enough to pass for calm. I want to be fair to Melissa in the telling of this, because a story where the daughter-in-law is simply a villain from the first page is not a true story. It's a cartoon, and I did not live through a cartoon. I believe now, and I believed even then in my more generous moments, that some of what drove her came from fear. Fear that her son would grow up more connected to a grandmother he adored than to her. Fear of a culture she didn't understand and had never bothered to learn. Fear, maybe, of not being enough on her own. Fear makes people build walls. It does not make the walls hurt any less when you're standing on the other side of one. Over the following year, the walls got taller. Visits shrank from monthly to occasional to eventually holidays only, and even those came with conditions. No beadwork gifts for Ethan, too easy for him to choke on, Melissa said, though the beads were sewn onto felt too sturdy for a 2-year-old to pull apart, and I know beadwork. I have made it safely for babies my whole life. No stories at bedtime when I babysat. "We're doing evidence-based sleep training," she told me once, as if the stories my grandfather told me under a night sky thick with more stars than this generation will ever see counted as noise pollution. No teaching him words in our language. That one hurt the most. I asked once, quietly, if I could teach my grandson to say grandmother the way my own grandmother had been called, and Melissa said, "We want him to have one clear identity, not be confused." I did not fight these rules the way I wanted to. I picked my battles the way you learn to when you're the one asking for access to a child rather than the one deciding it. I gave up the language lessons. I gave up the storytelling at bedtime, though I found ways to slip small pieces in. A song hummed while rocking him, nothing anyone could object to in words, even if the melody itself was older than this country. I told myself small victories mattered. I told myself patience was its own kind of strength, and for a native grandmother raising a mixed family grandson in a house that wanted to sand down anything that made him different, maybe that's true. But patience has a cost, too. It cost me 2 years of a relationship with my grandson that I will never get back. 2 years I spent being patient instead of present, and I think about that more than almost anything else in this story. There was a Tuesday visit early on that I still think about more than most. Ethan was maybe 14 months, old, just learning to pull himself up on furniture, and I'd brought a small rattle my grandfather had carved for me when I was a girl. Deer bone, worn smooth from handling, wrapped in soft leather with tiny shells that made a sound like rain when you shook it. Melissa took one look at it and asked where it had been sourced, as though it were a product off a shelf rather than something that had rattled in my own small hands 68 years earlier. I explained. She listened with her arms crossed, and at the end she said she'd need to look into the safety of the materials before it could stay in the house. I took the rattle home with me that day. It sits on my dresser now, and every time I see it, I remember standing in that living room holding a piece of my own childhood like it was something that needed permission to exist. Small moments like that one piled up faster than I let myself notice at the time. A birthday card I mailed that arrived opened, its contents, a beaded bracelet, nothing sharp, nothing unsafe, never mentioned again, never worn, never acknowledged. A photograph I'd asked to have taken of the two of us that somehow never made it into any of the albums Melissa kept so carefully on the mantel, full of pictures of her own parents, her own childhood home, her own family's holidays. I began to feel less like a grandmother and more like a guest whose visits required advance clearance. And I want to be honest and say that feeling ate at something in me I hadn't expected to have tested again after losing Joseph. I thought grief had already taught me every kind of loss a heart could carry. I was wrong. There is a particular loneliness in being pushed out of a child's life while that child is still close enough to reach, not gone, not lost to distance or death, just quietly, deliberately kept just out of arm's reach. I called my sister Rose during those months more than I probably should have. Rose still lives near where we grew up, still keeps the old ways close, and she listened to me describe the schedule taped to Melissa's door, the rattle sent home, the language I wasn't allowed to speak to my own grandchild, and she said something that stayed with me. "Helen, they're not just keeping him from you, they're keeping him from himself." I didn't fully understand what she meant until much later, until I watched my grandson struggle at 3 years old to answer a simple question about where his family came from with nothing but a shrug, because nobody in that house had ever given him an answer worth remembering. The trouble that led to the porch and the folder started as most trouble does, with money, though it took me time to understand that's really what it was about. Joseph left me the ranch land when he passed, 40 acres, not huge, but it had been in negotiations with a developer for 2 years by the time Ethan turned 3. A company wanting to build a resort corridor along the ridge, offering numbers that made my accountant go quiet on the phone the first time he read them out loud. I hadn't decided what to do with the offer. Some of that land held my husband's ashes, scattered at his request under the cottonwoods near the creek. Some of it held stories older than either of us, a place my grandfather once told me was a gathering ground before any fences existed. Selling it wasn't a simple financial decision for me. It was never going to be simple. Richard, Melissa's father, found out about the offer at a 4th of July barbecue I wasn't invited to, but heard about secondhand, the way you hear about most things concerning your own family once you've been pushed to the outside of it. He was, Daniel later told me, very interested in the number, very interested in what a woman my age, alone, without a husband to consult, might do with that kind of money, or more precisely, what she might be persuaded to do with it, and by whom. I didn't put the pieces together right away. I'm telling you now with the clarity that comes after, not the clarity I had while it was happening. While it was happening, all I knew was that visits with Ethan grew stranger. Melissa started asking casually how the land negotiations were going, whether I'd thought about setting up something for Ethan's future, whether I'd considered that a trust might be cleaner than leaving decisions to chance. I answered honestly each time. I hadn't decided. I was still thinking. I wanted to talk to Daniel about it when the time was right. Land like that deserves patience, not a quick answer written under pressure. Every honest answer I gave seemed to close a door somewhere I couldn't see. Around that same time, I started noticing changes in Daniel himself, not just in the house he lived in. He'd always called me on Sunday evenings, a habit from the year after Joseph died, when I think he worried quietly about me being alone in that big farmhouse kitchen. Those calls got shorter, then they got rarer. When we did talk, he sounded like a man reading from a script someone else had handed him, careful phrases about respecting boundaries and co-parenting as a united front, words that didn't sound like anything my son would have said on his own 2 years earlier. I recognized the shape of those sentences before I understood where they were coming from. I'd heard almost identical language at a Thanksgiving dinner the year before, holding court at the head of a table that wasn't his, explaining to the room how modern families protect their assets. I began paying closer attention after that, the way you learn to read a house by its silences rather than its noise. I noticed that Daniel had picked up part-time consulting work for one of Richard's business ventures, something in logistics, he said, extra income for the baby's college fund, nothing that concerned me. I noticed that Melissa's parents had started coming to nearly every family gathering, where once they'd been occasional guests. I noticed a new truck in Daniel's driveway, newer than anything he could have afforded on his own salary, and when I asked about it, he laughed it off as Richard being generous, the kind of laugh that doesn't quite reach a person's eyes. None of these things on their own would have alarmed me. Families help each other, in-laws are generous sometimes, and generosity isn't a crime. But I had grown up watching my grandfather read weather in the shape of clouds most people wouldn't look at twice, and something in me, call it instinct, call it the particular vigilance a mother develops for her only child, told me these weren't separate threads. They were the same rope, being braided slowly, one strand at a time, and I didn't yet know what it was being tied around. The visit that finally cracked things fully open happened at Ethan's second birthday party, 6 months before the porch and the folder. It was a small gathering, mostly Melissa's side of the family, held in their backyard under a rented canopy with a professional photographer Richard had hired for the occasion, the kind of touch that told you exactly whose vision this party belonged to. I brought a gift, a small cedar box I'd carved myself, meant to hold the things a child collects as he grows, the way my own grandmother had given me one on my second birthday, still sitting on a shelf in my bedroom 71 years later. Richard picked it up, turned it over once in his hands, and set it down on a side table without a word, moving on to admire a stack of expensive toys still in their boxes. It was such a small gesture. I don't think he meant anything cruel by it. He likely didn't think of it at all. But it told me everything about how my family, my traditions, my careful handmade offerings measured up against what this new extended family considered valuable. Later that afternoon, I overheard him talking to another guest near the drink table, his voice pitched low, but not low enough. He was talking about the ranch situation, about getting ahead of it before she does something sentimental with it, about needing the right structure in place. I stood very still behind the canopy post where I'd stopped to retie Ethan's shoe, and I let every word land. I didn't confront him that day. A party isn't the place, and I have never believed in giving people the satisfaction of watching you unravel in public, but I drove home with my hands tied on the wheel the whole way, and that night I called Frank Solomon for the first time in over a year, not because I had a document in front of me yet, but because some instinct told me I needed my own eyes on my own affairs before anyone else's hands got near them. Then came the week Melissa called and told me visits would be paused for a little while, just to establish some new routines with the baby. No explanation beyond that. I called Daniel directly, which I rarely did, because going around Melissa always seemed to cost him something later that I wasn't there to witness. He sounded tired. He said, "Mom, it's just easier if you let Melissa handle the schedule right now. There's a lot going on." "What's going on, Daniel?" A long pause. "Richard's helping us with some things, financial things. It's complicated." I should have pressed harder that day. I've turned that phone call over in my mind more times than I can count, wondering what would have happened if I'd asked the next question instead of letting my son's exhaustion talk me into patience one more time. But I didn't press. I let 3 weeks pass without seeing my grandson, 3 weeks that felt like the longest stretch of my life since Joseph died. And then Melissa called and asked me to come by. There was something they needed to discuss. That's the visit that ended on the porch, with the folder, with the light turned off. I took the contract home that night, and the next morning, before I let myself feel anything else about it, I called an old friend of Joseph's, a lawyer named Frank Solomon, who'd handled our land dealings for 20 years, and who I trusted the way you trust very few people outside your own blood.
I drove the folder to his office myself. I didn't want it faxed, scanned, or photographed. I wanted him to hold the actual paper, the same paper Melissa handed me, and tell me plainly what I was looking at. Frank read it twice. The second time, he read parts of it out loud, slowly, the way you read something to make sure you're not misunderstanding it yourself.
The first 2 pages were what Melissa had implied: restrictions on visitation, language, cultural teaching, gift-giving, all the things I'd already been living under informally, now written into something that looked official, though Frank told me plainly it held no legal weight whatsoever. No court would enforce a grandmother contract limiting a grandmother's speech to her own grandchild. It was designed to look official. It was designed to feel like law to a woman who wanted, more than almost anything, to be allowed back into a house with her grandson in it. But the 3rd and 4th pages were the real reason that folder existed. Buried in language about family financial planning and estate coordination was a clause granting Richard's firm, his firm, not Daniel's name anywhere on it, power of attorney over any land transaction I entered into going forward, positioned as protection in the event of diminished capacity, with a secondary clause naming a financial advisor from Richard's own company as the required broker on any sale of the ranch property. I sat in Frank's office and I felt something in my chest that I want to describe honestly, because I think a lot of women my age have felt this exact thing and never had the words for it. It wasn't only anger, it was the particular grief of realizing that the door you'd been standing outside of, the one you thought was locked because of cultural misunderstanding or new mother nerves or a young woman finding her footing, that door had actually been locked on purpose, and the key had a price tag on it the entire time, and the price was my grandson. "Helen," Frank said, "if you sign this, you're not agreeing to see your grandson under new house rules. You're signing over control of your land to a man you've met maybe 5 times in your life." I asked him if my son knew. Frank couldn't answer that. Nobody could answer that but Daniel. I drove to my son's workplace the next afternoon, not the house, because I didn't want Melissa in the room for this conversation, and I didn't want Richard anywhere near it either. I found Daniel in the parking lot at the end of his shift, and I didn't waste time with gentleness this time. I'd spent 2 years being gentle, and gentle had gotten me a folder and a dark porch. "Did you know what was in that contract?" I asked him. He looked at me the way he used to look at me as a boy when he'd broken something and hadn't decided yet whether to lie about it. "Mom, it's not what you think. Richard's just trying to help us get ahead financially. Melissa's been under a lot of stress. Daniel, did you know the 3rd page gave Richard's firm control over my land?" Silence. That was the answer. "He said it was standard," Daniel finally said, "for elder financial protection. He said a lot of families do it. Do you believe that?" Another silence, longer than the first, and then, quietly, the truest thing my son had said to me in 2 years. "I don't know what I believe anymore, Mom. I just want everyone to stop being upset with each other." I understood something in that parking lot that I hadn't let myself understand before. My son wasn't a villain in this story. He was a man caught between 2 forces, both claiming to want the best for his family, too tired and too conflict-averse to ask the hard questions that might have unraveled the whole arrangement 2 years earlier. Richard hadn't needed to trick Daniel into betraying his mother. He'd only needed Daniel's exhaustion and a wife willing to hold visitation as leverage, and enough time for a grandmother's love to soften her judgment. I did not shout at my son in that parking lot. My grandfather used to say that shouting is what people do when they've run out of truth, and I had plenty of truth left. I told him, calmly, that I loved him, that I loved Ethan more than I had words for, and that I would not be signing anything that handed a stranger control over land his father was buried beside. I told him I would keep trying to see my grandson through every legitimate channel available to me, and that I would not disappear quietly just because disappearing quietly was more comfortable for everyone else in the house.
Then I told him something else, something I'd decided in Frank's office the day before. I told him I was requesting mediated visitation through the family court, not to punish anyone, not for money, but because a grandmother's bond with her grandchild is not a bargaining chip, and I would rather stand in front of a judge and explain that plainly than sign my name to a document built on it.
The weeks that followed were not peaceful. Melissa called me twice, both times angry, once accusing me of trying to destroy the family over a piece of land nobody even needed. Richard sent a letter through an attorney implying I was an unstable elderly woman being manipulated by outside parties, a strange accusation given that the only outside party who'd shown up with a folder full of legal-sounding demands was standing in his own daughter's doorway. I won't pretend those weeks didn't cost me sleep. They did. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table with Joseph's old chair across from me, empty, and I asked him out loud what he would have done, because some nights a woman needs to ask the empty chair a question, even knowing it won't answer. I filled those weeks with the only thing that ever steadies me, work. I walked the ranch land every morning before the sun was fully up, the way I had as a girl, the way Joseph and I had walked it together for 30 years before he passed. I visited the cottonwoods by the creek where his ashes had settled into the soil, and I told him out loud about the contract, about Richard, about the fear that this land might be taken from our family's hands by paperwork instead of by the government the way it had so often been taken from people like us before. I am not a woman who scares easily, but I will admit those weeks tested something in me I hadn't had to test since I was young, the particular fear of watching something sacred slip through a door marked financial planning. Frank filed the mediation request on my behalf on a Tuesday. That same week, an unfamiliar man came to my door claiming to represent a family advisory service, offering unsolicited to help me understand my options regarding the land. I didn't invite him past the porch. I asked him plainly who had sent him, and when he wouldn't answer directly, I closed the door. Gently, not the way Melissa had closed hers on me, but firmly enough that he understood there would be no second knock answered. I called Frank immediately after. He wasn't surprised. He told me these kinds of pressure visits weren't uncommon when there was real money involved and a target who lived alone. That word, target, sat heavy with me for days. I had spent my whole life being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's grandmother. I had never once thought of myself as a target for anything, and learning that I now was, simply because I owned land and lived without a husband beside me, changed something in how carefully I moved through my own days. The mediation hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October at the county courthouse, a squat brick building I'd driven past 1,000 times without ever imagining I'd need to walk inside it over my own grandson. I arrived early, dressed the way my mother taught me to dress for anything that mattered, plain, dignified, nothing that could be used against me, nothing that gave anyone an excuse to call me anything other than exactly what I was. I sat on a hard bench in a hallway that smelled like floor wax and old paper, and I rehearsed, quietly, what I would say if a judge asked me why I was there. Not for money, not for spite, for my grandson, and for the right to be his grandmother without a signature standing between us. But here is where the story turns, because every true story turns somewhere, and mine turned in a courthouse hallway on a Thursday in October. Daniel showed up, alone. No Melissa, no Richard. He'd requested to speak with the mediator privately before the scheduled session, and when he came out into the hallway where I was waiting, his face had the look of a man who'd spent a long night doing something he should have done 2 years earlier, reading every page of a document carefully instead of trusting someone else's summary of it. "I read the whole file Frank sent you," he said. "The land clause, the advisor requirement, all of it." He sat beside me on that hard courthouse bench, the kind that makes your back ache after 10 minutes, and for a long moment he didn't say anything else. Then,
Richard's business has been struggling, Mom, has been for a while. Melissa didn't tell me how bad until I asked her straight out last week. The land deal wasn't about protecting Ethan's future. It was about Richard needing access to capital and using our family, using you to get it. I didn't say I told you so. A mother doesn't get to say that to a son who's just walked himself through the hardest realization of his marriage. I put my hand over his the way I used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms, and I let him keep talking. He told me Melissa hadn't fully understood the extent of it either, that Richard had brought the contract already drafted, framed as a way to formalize boundaries that she genuinely wanted, and had folded the financial clauses in without walking her through exactly what they meant, banking on her not reading legal language closely, banking on her wanting those visitation restrictions badly enough to sign whatever came attached to them. I don't know even now how much of that is true and how much is a young woman's own regret reshaping the story to make her more of a bystander than a participant. Both things can be partly true at once. Families are rarely as simple as one clean villain and one clean victim, and I've lived long enough to stop expecting them to be. What I do know is what happened next. Daniel canceled the mediation session, not because he was choosing Richard's side, but because he told the mediator plainly in front of me that his mother never needed a court order to be part of his son's life, that whatever had gone wrong in his house was his responsibility to fix, and he intended to fix it without a judge deciding it for him. That evening, he came to the ranch, just him. He stood in the kitchen where he'd grown up, where his father used to sit reading the paper every morning before sunrise, and he cried the way men in my family don't often let themselves cry, and he told me he was sorry, not for something small, but for 2 years of small silences as it added at them to something that almost cost me my land and cost his son a grandmother who could have taught him who he was. I won't tell you the marriage healed overnight because that wouldn't be honest, and I promised myself telling you the truth mattered more than telling you something tidy. Daniel and Melissa spent months in counseling. Richard's business troubles became his own to solve without my land as the solution. The contract was torn up, literally by Daniel standing in my kitchen, 4 pages fed one at a time into the wood stove Joseph used to load every winter morning. I watched the pages curl and blacken through the little glass window in the stove door, and I thought about how much power a piece of paper can hold, right up until the moment someone decides it doesn't hold any power at all.
There was a difficult conversation with Richard that I wasn't present for, but Daniel told me about it afterward, how he'd driven to Richard's office and told him plainly that the ranch was no longer part of any conversation involving his business, that his mother's land was not a resource to be managed by anyone outside the family, and certainly not by a man who had used his own daughter's marriage as a door into it. Richard, by Daniel's account, didn't apologize. Men like that rarely do, not because they can't see what they did, but because apologizing would mean admitting the calculation had been a calculation at all, rather than the help he'd always called it. I didn't need his apology. I have found, at 73, that waiting for an apology from a man who will never give one is its own kind of trap, and I had already spent enough of my life waiting on other people's doorsteps. The following spring, I invited the whole family out to the ranch for the first time in years. Not a formal occasion, nothing with a rented canopy or a hired photographer, just a Sunday afternoon with a fire pit and food cooked the way my mother taught me to cook it, slow, over coals, with everyone expected to help rather than be served. Melissa came. She stood a little apart from the rest of us at first, the way a person does in a place that isn't theirs yet, watching me show Ethan how to find the arrowhead-shaped stones along the creek bed, the same ones Joseph used to help Daniel search for at that same age. At one point, she came and crouched down beside us, quiet, and asked if she could learn too. I handed her a stone, and I showed her what to look for. And it wasn't a grand reconciliation, nothing a camera would have caught as meaningful, but it was real, and real things, in my experience, matter more than grand ones.
Melissa and I are not close the way some grandmothers and daughters-in-law become close. I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of a nicer ending, but she called me herself 3 weeks after that night in my kitchen and asked, not told, asked if I'd like to come teach Ethan the drum song I used to hum when I rocked him as an infant. It wasn't an apology dressed up in fine words. It was better than that. It was an action, small and specific, offered without a folder attached to it. I see my grandson every week now. Real visits, no printed schedule taped to a door. Last month, for the first time, he said a word to me in our language. Just one, just grandmother, the same word my own grandmother taught me to call her by a lifetime ago on land 200 miles from here. He said it clumsily, the way any 3-year-old says a new word, and I had to leave the room for a moment so he wouldn't see an old woman cry over something so small and so enormous at the same time. I sold 12 acres of the ranch land eventually, not to Richard's associates, not under anyone's pressure, but to a young native family building a cultural center along the ridge, close enough to the cottonwoods that Joseph's resting place would always be tended by people who understood what that ground meant. The rest of the land stays in the family, held the old way, not as collateral for anyone's business troubles, but as something to be walked on and remembered and eventually handed down, the way it was handed to me. My grandfather used to say that the strongest trees are not the ones that never bend in the wind, but the ones whose roots run deep enough that bending doesn't break them. I bent a great deal these past few years. I let silence stand where I should have asked harder questions. I let patience become something closer to disappearance. But my roots held because they were planted long before that porch, long before that folder, long before a man named Richard ever decided a grandmother's love might be worth something on paper. If you are a grandmother reading this tonight and someone has ever handed you a door with conditions attached to it, I want you to hear this from me plainly. Your love for that child is not a thing to be negotiated. Ask the hard questions early, read every page, and never, ever let anyone convince you that patience and disappearance are the same kindness. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Has anyone in your family ever tried to put a price on your place in it? Tell me your story. I read every one.